This is the Western Digital SN750 SE, the 250GB version specifically. And thanks to in-depth research from one of our amazing Patreon supporters, shout out to Fiddler2K for this one, well, it may well be the least capable compatible NVMe drive that works on PlayStation 5. Now, it'll operate just fine on a Windows machine, but on paper at least, should be a bit of a turkey on PS5. But conversely, this is the Western Digital SN850 1TB, and this drive is so good for PlayStation 5, gets a ringing endorsement from none other than system architect Mark Cerny himself. But before we go on, let's be clear, this video isn't sponsored by Western Digital. It's just that Western Digital happens to be the only supplier that can serve up both the best and the worst PS5 compatible PCIe Gen 4 drives. So look, the new system firmware for PlayStation 5 is now available for all, meaning that if you own the latest Sony console, you can now augment your machine with extra storage via the M2 expansion bay in the machine. And I wanted to test the best and the worst drives to see what the actual difference is and to get a measure of just how important the SSD is for PS5 gaming thus far. So that means that yes, we will be carrying out load time tests, copying tests, and of course gameplay tests in Insomniac's brilliant Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, widely believed to be the most storage heavy video game available for consoles right now. First up, a quick reminder on installation. There's no plug and play solution for PlayStation 5. You need to spend 5 or 10 minutes installing the SSD into your console. Before that though, Sony recommends installing a heatsink onto the SSD if it doesn't come with one attached. So the Mark Cerny-approved SN850 has one already built into the design, but the bargain basement SN750 SE doesn't. So I grabbed this aluminum heatsink from Amazon, courtesy of renowned brand Kirinuzri. It's a sandwich-like design really. Insert a thermal pad, add the SSD, put a thermal pad on the actual heatsink and then combine it all together and screw it up. After removing the side plate and the SSD bay cover, the SSD itself plugs into the PlayStation 5 and screws in, but be sure to move the spacer, usually up to the 80 mark. Close up the PS5 and you're good to go. Right then, so what's so bad about the SN750 SE? So here's the thing, while Sony has very specific guidelines for PCIe Gen 4 NVMe drives to use on PS5, the SN750 SE essentially ignores all of them. Sony recommends sequential read bandwidth of at least 5,500 megabytes per second. The SN750 SE in its 250GB form only goes up to 3,200 megabytes per second. That's a mere 58.2% of the bandwidth Sony is asking for in its system specs. Higher capacity versions of the SN750 SE do actually read faster. But look, my test here was about the worst of the worst, right? And in fact, the SN750 SE is basically a PCIe Gen 4 version of WD's SN550 PCIe Gen 3 drive with seemingly the same NAND and the same Phison controller, which incidentally is also used in Xbox Series SSDs, both internal and external. It's DRAM-less, meaning there's no on-drive cache, known for radically improving performance. Instead, in PCs, this drive uses something known as the host memory buffer, meaning that memory within the PC itself is used as a buffer instead. Sony doesn't use HMB and actually specifically advises that drives that do may have slower than expected performance, but we're going to be trying it anyway. The SN850 meanwhile is one of the best PCIe Gen 4 SSDs on the market. It does have onboard cache and is rated for 7,000 megabytes per second sequential reads. It's a nigh on 2.2 times multiplier in sequential read bandwidth compared to the SN750 SE. And it's up there as one of the most performant drives on the market, as you'd expect if Mark Cerny is using it in his own PS5, right? So first things first, despite its stated specs, the PS5's bandwidth tester is actually inaccurate and needs to be sorted out. It underestimates the SN850's performance with this circa 6,543 megabyte per second read speed measurement. I mean, no big deal perhaps, we're still safely within spec, but maybe the PS5's interface is slightly constricted or some such. However, when you plug in the much slower SN750 SE, the read speed test comes in at around 5,174 megabytes per second. It's basically saying that the drive is almost 62% faster than it actually is. Now look, I'm going to cut to the chase here because fundamentally I've set the scene and you want to see this potential dumpster fire of an SSD in action, right? The SN750 SE is a cheap and cheerful SSD that is pretty good for its price point on PC. I mean, this 250 gig model here is around £56. Not too bad for a Gen 4 drive. But by every criteria you can come up with, it's not really a good idea to put this in a PS5. The only worse option is the Xbox Series SSD, which is PCIe Gen 4, but doesn't have 4 lanes of bandwidth, so doesn't work on PS5. So consider this the worst case scenario Gen 4 drive that does work on PS5, and if you're wondering why I've cut away at this point to show gameplay capture of Ratchet and Clank during this protracted ramble, well, somewhat surprisingly, this is actually the game playing on the SN750 SE. It's not just working, it's working pretty well to the point where I don't think anyone would be able to tell the difference compared to the internal drive. Certainly not based on the game segments I've run through performance analysis. In fact, let's show you our findings here. Performance RT mode, 60 frames per second, both of our Western digital drives here up against the PlayStation 5's internal SSD. In this segment of the game, Ratchet zooms through a range of environments, and there are small stutters with each transition from one zone to the next. The variance between the drives is literally single frame stuff. They all stutter in the same places, even the mighty internal drive. There can be very slight variances run to run, likely inconsequential really, and no one drive seems better than another. I also did a test of this boss fight just using the Western digital drives. Remember that the stutter can change slightly from run to run, but in this particular comparison, I actually found the SN750 SE's split-second freezes to be slightly lesser in nature than the SN850's, both here and later on in the boss fight when the action transitions back to the original stage. Interesting stuff. Now, Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is also interesting in that Insomniac taps into the PS5's low-level storage APIs to produce phenomenally fast loading, both from the front end into the game and from the initial menus back into the action. So let's take a look at that. Here we get a pecking order you'd expect to see, with the internal drive loading first in 7 seconds. It's just over 8 for the on-spec SN850, and then almost 10 seconds for the cheapo SN750 SE. It's still not a bad showing for a drive with such paltry specs compared to the competition on offer here. I also did direct comparisons loading into 4 different game save states. While the drives still complete loading in the same order, the point is that Ratchet is incredibly fast to get back into gameplay no matter what drive you have. And even the SN750 SE is holding up. There's literally a split second between them. I also did a couple of loading time tests with the native PS5 rendition of Ghost of Tsushima, launching a couple of game states from the front end menus, and this time I found the SN850 to be consistently faster than the internal drive, the SN750 SE to be last on every run, but the point is that again, there's only a split second difference between all of them. You can quite happily game on any of them. I also gave control loading times a test. Initial boots on this and many games aren't particularly good for testing, as there's a lot of logos and preliminary nonsense to wade through before you get to an actual interactive menu, and you've no idea if there's background loading going on or not. For this title, I loaded up a game save, then used fast travel to move between available locations. Load times in general are around 7 to 13 seconds, which isn't particularly amazing for PlayStation 5, but is still a vast leap over the last gen versions of this game. We're seeing a title here that uses the SSD, but doesn't use the low-level APIs for maximum loading time acceleration. Point is that again, we're looking at split-second differences, and if we're really being picky, the SN850 is marginally faster than the internal drive and the SN750 SE. I also wanted to throw in a banana skin game, and that is Cyberpunk 2077 running under back compat, which has a bizarre storage issue on PlayStation 5. In previous testing, Tom found that loading times on PS4 Pro are actually faster than PS5 when using the same SSD connected via USB. And just generally, PS4 games running under back compat seem to run better from any kind of solid-state storage that isn't the internal drive. So I'm cycling through 3 saves here, and the first sees both Western Digital SSDs load around a second ahead of the internal drive. The second save sees the internal drive redeem itself, but it's still very much a long time to wait, at just under 23 seconds. The other drives aren't much slower. Our final save sees the SN750 SE complete its load first. Internal drive virtually the same speed, and SN850 a touch later. There is variance in loading times from run to run on any drive, which leads us on to the data transfer tests, measured by copying games to and from the NVMe drive from the custom internal SSD. So the process of copying to SSD, we should expect the SN850 to monster the SN750 SE, but I was not expecting the gulf to be quite so wide, and neither did I expect to be hanging around this long. Nor did I expect wildly inconsistent transfer times. I actually did 3 runs of copying Cyberpunk from internal drive to the SN750 SE because none of them made sense. SN850 blasts through the transfer 100.4 gigs in a fraction over 71 seconds, meaning that we're writing at 1.4 gigabytes per second, and that's not bad. The SN750 SE doesn't just collapse in write speed terms, it does so spectacularly. 2 runs were over 12 minutes, while the best I could get before giving up and getting bored by the whole process was well over 9 minutes. Things are a little less bizarre with other titles, but still there's a big gulf. Marvel's Avengers is a 96GB game these days. Writing to our drives takes 3 minutes 27 on the SN750 SE and just 1 minute 17 on the SN850, and this is more in line with expectations. Elsewhere though, the cheap drive did not do well. Transferring Ghost of Tsushima saw another gigantic win for the SN850. I mean, it takes almost 9 times longer to transfer on the 750 SE. You might remember from Tom's prior testing that writing back to the internal SSD from an internally installed NVMe drive is a long and drawn-out process. Perhaps for endurance purposes, writing to the internal custom SSD in PS5 is very slow, and to be honest, it's rare that games are going to need to carry out extended write sessions. So that's okay, just a bit of a pain when it comes to shuttling games about. The same holds true for our test drives. Shuttling 100 gigs worth of Cyberpunk 2077 back to the internal drive takes over 7 minutes on both SSDs, though weirdly the SN750 SE is a bit faster here. Write speeds are around 0.27 gigabytes per second, which isn't great. We get very similar transfer rates back to the internal drive when we move 96 gigs worth of Avengers back to the custom SSD too. So I'd say that this is clearly an artificial limitation put in place by Sony. Okay, so let's wrap up. I guess the big surprise here is that the lowest spec PCIe Gen 4 drive that we could find, and that works on PlayStation 5, runs Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart seemingly just fine with no apparent issues in gameplay, though we should stress that we've not played the whole game through on the drive. But certainly in areas where we expect storage to be stressed, the SN750 SE is working fine. But it is important to note that storage on the next generation of machines isn't just about the solid-state drive itself, but also the dedicated hardware decompression tech that works alongside it. This effectively doubles the bandwidth of the drive and is just as essential to the PlayStation 5 as the SSD itself. Now, I'm sure some will be saying that Ratchet & Clank isn't tapping into the full potential of the SSD, and I think the point is we can't really forget that it is a first-generation PlayStation 5 game. We shouldn't expect to be seeing developers wringing every last bit of potential out of the hardware. It's still very early days. The SN750 SE seemed to have genuine slowdown issues in copying games across in some scenarios, but otherwise its loading performance in-game seems to be comparable, to a degree that I also found surprising. But I am disappointed that Sony's built-in benchmark is so inaccurate. It suggests that the drive is close to spec, but really it isn't. And while I'm not hugely worried about the games of today, which seem to run fine, I would worry about performance on more demanding titles going forward. I honestly think some kind of super storage-heavy tech demo should be released to give these drives a proper workout, or at the very least, to have the console properly benchmark the SSD after formatting, and to do so accurately. That would be useful, right? Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this one, meaning it's like, subscribe, share time with a healthy side portion of bell ringing for supposedly instant notifications if you're already subbed. The DF Supporter Program, you know you want to. Support the team more directly, get a big bunch of great bonus material, extra content, early access, and the chance to interact with the team and with our amazing community on Discord. And of course, those pristine quality video downloads from digitalfoundry.net aren't going away. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for making it right the way to the end of this one, assuming that you did, of course. And yeah, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.